This is a video on quadratics, and it's about making a quadratic from its roots. And this process is kind of the reverse of the process that we've used for factorising and solving quadratics. So before I actually get into a question about making one from its roots, I want to just look at our normal process, and then we'll see how making the quadratic from its roots is like the reverse of that process. So let's take the example of x squared plus 5x minus 14 equals 0. So we're just going to factorise and solve this just like we've been doing all along. So I make my guide number, which is 1 by 14. So that's 14, and then I have to factorise that. And I get 1 by 14 or 2 by 7. And I want to use different signs, because of this minus at the end, to add and subtract these to make my plus 5. So that means using 2 and 7. So I'm going to write x squared plus 7x minus 2x minus 14 equals 0. And then I'm going to factorise. And then I'm going to make my two brackets. And at this stage then, I let each of those brackets equals to 0. And then I solve to get the x by itself. And here are my two solutions. And remember that we call the solutions of a quadratic its roots. And we'd also spoken about how we can visualise what's going on here. So our quadratic is drawn as a parabola, which is a curve. We have our x-axis, and the points where we go through the x-axis are the roots. So this particular quadratic goes through the x-axis at minus 7 and at 2. So I just want to take a second to look back up through this calculation and just point a couple of things out. So first of all, that these solutions here are my roots, and the numbers that I've marked on the x-axis are also called my roots. And if I go back a line from my roots, these two pieces of information, the x minus 2 and the x plus 7, they're my factors. And that in the quadratic, you can see here, each of the factors is in brackets multiplying by the other. So the factors multiply. And when they multiply, they make the quadratic. So that's the process we're going to go through if we know what the roots are. We're basically going to start at the bottom line of the question and work our way back up to make the quadratic. Now, we may be given the roots in written form like this. So we might be told the roots are 2 and minus 7. And they might just say the roots are 2 and minus 7. Or they might say the roots are x equals 2 and x equals minus 7. Or they may give us a diagram, in which case we look for the numbers where the quadratic or the parabola cuts through the x-axis, because those are the roots. Okay, so let's look at an example. So my example is the roots of a quadratic are x equals 3 and x equals 4, and I want to form the quadratic. So to solve this out, I'm going to start off by putting a heading at the side called roots, and I'm going to write down my two roots. So that's easy, x equals 3, x equals 4. On the next line, I'm going to use that information about the roots to make the factors. Okay, so now if we look back to the very end of our initial question there, where we just factorised out and solved as normal, you can see that to get from the roots back to the factors, I just need to bring the root across the equal sign to get the root back to being equal to 0. When it's equal to 0, I've got the factor. So that's easy enough to do down here. I'll just bring the 3 across, and that'll give me x minus 3. And then I'll bring the 4 across, and that'll give me x minus 4. Okay, so before I go on to the next bit then, I'm just glancing back up here again to the top. What did I do in that question where I factorised and solved? Okay, so we're trying to backtrack. So we had our roots, we had our factors, the factors multiplied together in brackets. So that's exactly what I'm going to do down here at the bottom. I'm going to put the x minus 3 in a bracket and the x minus 4 in a bracket and multiply them together. And now it's a question of multiplying out these brackets carefully. So remember, to multiply out a double set of brackets, I need to split the first bracket up and multiply each bit by the second bracket. Just like this. And then multiplying carefully, what am I going to get? Well, x by x is going to give me x squared. X by minus 4 is going to give me minus 4x. Minus 3 by x is going to give me minus 3x. And minus 3 by minus 4 is going to give me plus 12. And an equals 0 on the end. And just watch out there with things like that plus 12. When you're multiplying a negative by a negative, you're going to get a positive, so just be careful of that. Okay, so we're nearly there at this stage. We just have one little bit of tidying up to finish it off, which is just to put the like terms together. And I'm just adding and subtracting here now. So minus 4 minus 3 makes minus 7. So here I have x squared minus 7x plus 12 equals 0. And I suppose since I label the roots and I label the factors, and this is the actual quadratic, I'll write that in as a heading there on the left as well. The headings are nice because they give you a little bit of structure to follow. So that's always the approach that you're going to take. The roots make the factors multiply together. When you multiply together, you get the quadratic at the end. So let's look at a second example now where the information is presented in a slightly different way. So this time, instead of saying the roots are, I'm giving you a diagram, but we can clearly see that these 2 points are marked out, -3 and 2, where the parabola or the quadratic passes through the x-axis. That's the information that we're going to use this time to form the quadratic. And we'll use the same layout as before. We'll name our roots, we'll make our factors, we'll multiply, and we'll tidy it up to make the quadratic. Okay, so first of all, our roots. So x equals -3 and x equals 2. Notice that the x wasn't written into the diagram as part of the information, but we always say the roots are x equals those values. And that's because that's where they're going through the x-axis, which is that horizontal axis that we've seen back in the coordinate geometry of the line chapter as well. Okay, so now that I've got the roots, I want to make the factors. Okay, so that means that I want to get the information from the roots over to the left-hand side so it's equals to 0. So -3 is going to go over and I'm going to have x plus 3. And the 2 is going to go over and I'm going to have x minus 2. So now I've made my 2 factors and then I'm going to use those to make the quadratic. So that just means multiplying my factors together. And at this stage you should be well able to multiply this out yourself. So pause the video here and do that and then play and see if you're correct. Okay, so I'm splitting up that first bracket and multiplying each bit by the second bracket. That's going to give me x squared minus 2x, excuse me, plus 3x minus 6. Just watch out there at the end, a positive by a negative is a negative when multiplying. And then finally tidying it up. It's x squared plus 1x minus 6 equals 0. Just watch out here, minus 2 plus 3. We're not multiplying here, we're just adding and subtracting. So we end up with plus 1. And I've written in my heading on the left there, quadratic, just to kind of keep that structure. Okay, so let's look at example number 3 now. Okay, so in this example, the roots of a quadratic are x equals 1 and x equals 2/3 form the quadratic. Now, you can probably see what's a little bit different in this example already. It's the fact that I've got a fraction here for one of my roots. That's pretty easy to deal with, but I'll show you how in a moment. So we'll start with the exact same process as before, making a note of the roots and then writing down what they are. So I've got x equals 1 and x equals 2/3. Next, I need to make my factors. So the x equals 1 is easy. I just bring the 1 across and it's x minus 1. So I'll write x minus 1 equals 0. When I have a fraction like this, I don't just bring the fraction across and subtract it. I've got a couple of steps that I have to follow. And the first of these steps is to take the bottom of the fraction, the denominator, and bring it up in front of the x and multiply. So that then will give me 3x equals 2. But I know that to get the factor properly, I need to have it equal to 0, so I'm not quite finished yet. So I bring up that denominator and multiply, and then I bring the number on the right across. And, well, at the moment it's positive, so I'll subtract it. So when I have a fraction as a root, I've got a couple of steps that I have to go through. Denominator up as a coefficient of the x, and then bring the numerator across and change its sign. And from this point on then, it's just business as usual. So I'll multiply my factors. And again, just to point out, the factors are the ones that I have when I finally have it equal to 0. So my brackets will look like this, and then I'll split them up and multiply as normal. And then just take care with your multiplication as always. So we end up with x by 3x is 3x squared, x by minus 2 is minus 2x, minus 1 by 3x is minus 3x, and then a minus by a minus makes a plus, 1 by 2 is 2. And then just finally, one more little bit of tidying up to get our final line. And we end up with 3x squared. Now minus 2 minus 3, we're not multiplying here, we're just adding and subtracting. So minus 2 minus 3 makes minus 5, plus 2 equals 0, and that's my quadratic.